Morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'd like to thank Shishin Roshi and Roshi Shinko for allowing to talk to you this morning. I'd also like to thank all our senseis and Dharma holders. We have an embarrassment of riches in this Sangha. When a smaller Sangha like ours, there's we have access to teachers that you wouldn't necessarily have in a larger Zen center. And for those of you who have spent time in a larger Zen center, that's something you'd be familiar with. Sometimes the teachers are remote, so I respectfully hope that we can all appreciate that together. For our newer friends, my name's Keido. My Christian name is Chris. It's actually kind of a Catholic Mexican American name, Christopher Joseph. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, just down the road from Great Mountain. This morning, I want to talk about imperfect practice. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines imperfect as flawed in form, structure, or function, and incomplete action. The Latin root is the same, imperfectus. And before you get impressed with my Latin, I had to look up this morning how you do Latin pronunciation. So, um, I sound like a pro now. There are a lot of synonyms for imperfection. Not all of them are useful for me for this morning's talk. One of them I like, that's deficient, that's useful. But defective was one of them, and that's maybe not so useful and maybe a little discouraging, if not downright harmful in some circumstances. But the topic could have just as easily been perfect practice, which should tell you a bit about where I'm headed. But that maybe could be explored another time. In the same dictionary, I looked up the definition of practice, which is to do or perform often, customarily or habitually, to perform or work at repeatedly in order to become proficient, and to train by repeated exercises. I like that definition. I don't have a problem with that. So, putting those two definitions together, one way of looking at imperfect practice is that it's in a flawed or incomplete habit. And I feel optimistic about that. Not only does imperfect practice mean things can get better, but it gives us genuine power and agency. We have the power to make it better. I don't want to get into the definition of better or defining what better is, the subjective and objective views of betterness or whatever. Would be here all day if I did that. But my practice has always been imperfect and flawed from the very beginning of my Buddhist journey, and often embarrassingly so. I started my Buddhist practice, although I would not have called it a practice or even recognized it as a practice. I don't know what I would have called it. It was an encounter, an accident, something like that. But I began when I was about 19 or 20. And although I didn't really understand it as practice in a conscious way, um, for some reason I had deluded myself that I wanted to be an architect. And I didn't even know what an architect was. I didn't know what an architect did. But I wanted to be an architect. So, like all famous architects do, I went to my local community college and in Southern California, and I had to knock out some general credits. And in order to do that, I took a world religions course. I had no interest in world religions. I had no interest in religion at all. And in fact, I didn't consider myself to be a seeker. I wasn't I would say I was anti-religion, but as far as this class, I was just agnostic. Seemed kind of interesting. It was probably better than some of the other ones. But when I read the chapter on Buddhism, I was captivated by it, specifically the chapter on Zen. And it felt to me like I was meeting a long lost friend who kind of knew how I saw the world. And I imagine some of you probably could relate to that. But in reality, and I can now only see this in hindsight, decades in hindsight, I'm 55 now, that maybe that isn't what was going on, this kind of idea that I was meeting an old friend. Maybe there was some of that, maybe not. And hindsight's not 2020, by the way, no matter what people say. Maybe it's worse than even present vision, depending. But like Paul of Tarsus said, we see through we see through a glass dimly. And he also wrote, "Love never ends. Knowledge will pass away because our knowledge is imperfect." So it's not a coincidence. So in hindsight, what I think kind of what was going on is I was looking for something I was lacking in my childhood. I wanted to be an architect so I can get the love and attention I didn't get and that I desperately craved. And that's probably why I had such a shallow, superficial idea of what an architect was and why I wanted to be one. I didn't care. I just wanted love and attention. And when I discovered Buddhism, although it rang familiar and true, I instantly converted it into another ego project to use it as a way, to fulfill my emotional needs, like a hungry ghost. Maybe not like a hungry ghost, maybe an actual hungry ghost. But that's okay. It's not a problem because once my foot was on the path, I was okay. I see that now. And that goes the same, I think, for anyone, no matter where anyone's at, once their foot's on the path, as long as they practice the imperfect practice, um, encountering Zazen every day, endeavoring to make one choice after, as opposed to another every day, eventually these things sort of tend to work themselves out one way or another. So what if I was a deluded, hungry ghost? So what if I was using the Dharma to feed my own unsatiable ego to create a false identity? I thought that if I could become enlightened, not only would I solve all my personal problems, but it would also be a nice, new, unassailable identity, and no one would ever be able to hurt me again, right? And that's totally fine, imperfect. And it was a great place to be, actually, because where could I go from there, right? As long as my foot was on the path, again, I would not have said that at the time, but I could only improve. And one nice thing about, when you're reading Buddhist stuff, you pretty quickly know it's describing something that's outside of your experience. So even a delusional, hungry ghost like myself knew um, that this was something to aspire to. It was not something that I could just, snap my finger and pull it off a rack and put it on and say, "Hey, I've got this." Yeah, even in my own dimness, I could see that this was something that needed some practice. And that type of ego project never works. And in Zen practice, that type of thing eventually collapses, thankfully. And we're lucky to be in a community where our misperceptions all eventually collapse. Since we're imperfect, we can't see that. I have many embarrassing stories I could tell you about, things I've encountered in my Zen practice, mistakes I've had, arguments with teachers, members of the Sangha, and in general, just being a dummy. But that's, another time, maybe another story. But what I will say is that from my early 20s and to my 30s, I spent about 10 years living and practicing in monasteries and temples, California, Colorado, New York, Nevada, and New Mexico, and working as a carpenter to support my Zen studies. but I just could not relax into my Zazen. I understand now that I had very tightly constructed and defended defense mechanisms, very automatic. And Zazen, often would turn into a confrontation with terror or confrontation with, unexplained fear. And I lived with Jitsudo Roshi for about 7 years, and he put up with a lot with me. And he tried to help me move past these um, defense mechanisms. And although I think that he did know and had some kind of understanding, he wasn't a psychologist. And in fact, he was a guy who graduated from high school, a kind of a hippie guy who ended up becoming a Zen teacher and a nice person, by the way. He's not with us anymore, but he saw in his own kind of intuitive way that I was defensive. But he was not really able to assist me in dismantling these. And it took me many, many years. I remember walking out of evening Zazen on multiple occasions, particularly during Zazen, and my body would be shaking uncontrollably, almost like I was having a seizure. I was barely able to walk. Now, and if I see anybody like that now, I haven't ever seen anyone do anything like that, but I know now that's actually a very good sign. I take that as a good sign. Then I saw it as a failure. I saw it as I'm not a very good Zen student. I could do better. Nobody else is shaking. Therefore, they must be doing something better that I'm not doing. And I experienced it as humiliating and discouraging. But I had enough insight to keep going. I didn't stop going, no matter how painful and degrading. I saw through a glass darkly, but I kept up. And it wasn't really until I met Shishin Roshi and Roshi Shinko that I was able to sort of figure out a way to start letting go of these defense mechanisms. Um, we could talk about that more, how that happens later on. But it kind of sounds funny to talk about this in a Dharma talk. But it's nothing new, and I don't think I'm alone. In fact, about 2,000 years ago, the Lotus Sutra included the parable of the good father. And for those of you who are not familiar with the story, in the Lotus Sutras, there's this parable about a father, and he has a big giant house with only one door. And the house is rotten, it's falling apart, and it's on fire. And he has some kids, and all the kids are playing with their favorite toys. And I'll read a quote from the Lotus Sutra. I think it puts it better than I can. Though I'm able to get safely out of the burning house, yet my children are in the burning house, are pleasurably absorbed in amusements. Thought that the fire is pressing on them, they do not mind or fear, and have no impulse to escape. So the kids won't listen to their dad, and he tells them, we got to get out of here. They won't listen. So what he tells them is he says, you know, whatever toys you have outside are toys that are greater than the ones that you have now. They're the greatest toys ever. And if you just step outside, I'll give you all the toys that you want. Of course, again, there's only one door. And so the kids go through the one door. And, of course, what they get are not toys, but what they get, in the florid language of Indian Buddhism or ancient Buddhism. Maybe this is Chinese. I think it was the fourth or fifth century that this was written. But, what they get are golden chariots abundant with silken banners and, jewels and lapis lazuli and all of these nice metaphors for the awakened mind. And so, the imperfection in practice was even located and identified in the Lotus Sutra. And by the way, I read this very early on in my practice and kept that under my belt and would think of it often as I was struggling with my practice. Um, just reminding myself that, no matter what I'm fascinated with now, my pain or my embarrassment or my aspirations or whatever it was, that it really wasn't it. It wasn't really the place to stop, that I needed to keep going. And that, this was a well-established thing in our tradition. So the imperfect way I came to the Dharma with this raging hunger for ego gratification, the great masters and all the monks and writers, and they saw me coming a mile away, 1,000 years away. So it's okay if my project, if my ego, if the Dharma was my ego project, because it just was never going to work. It just collapses over and over, but on more and more subtle ground. The sand gets finer and finer, and it never ends. The collapses never stop. They just become more subtle. In a way, nothing is different than it was before. The parable of the good father is sort of on the less developed end of practice. It kind of really maybe describes the beginning of practice or how you might sort of get started. But my point's just that even when a person's so deluded that they pervert the Dharma to their own disordered ends, as long as practice is sincere, they can't fail. Eventually, the ego project collapses, and that's why imperfect practice is perfect. That's my view, and I think I'm in good company. In the four vows, we recite, it's right there. Numberless creations, I vow to receive. Inexhaustible delusions, I vow to dissolve. Omnipresent Dharma gates, I vow to experience. Unsurpassable enlightened way, I vow to manifest. And we recite that. Inexhaustible delusions, not some delusions, not the ones we dislike, all of them, forever. They never end. The imperfection never ends. And I think that's a great thing. And if the parable of the good father talks about the beginning of practice or how someone might come to practice in a poetic way, sort of hinting at a bright future, Zen Master Dogen anchors imperfection in the present. And here's a quote from his essay, Bendoa, from the 13th century. Although disturbances and illusions flow in and out during Zazen, they do not disrupt or interfere with anything. And a little bit earlier, I talked about how Jitsudo didn't seem to have the skill to, I guess, instruct me or lead me to a place where my defense mechanisms were not quite as tightly defended or quite so automatic or opaque. I'm not quite sure how to put it. But he wasn't really able to help me turn my imperfections into a tool. But that changed when I came to this Sangha. And it's not an advertisement, by the way, although it kind of sounds like one. Maybe I was just ready to hear it. Maybe Jitsudo did say it. I just was not able to hear him. Um, or maybe when I came to Great Mountain, it was worded in a way I could grasp. Um, I'm not quite sure why I was able to receive the teachings that I did, but fortunately, and I like to think it was at least in part because of the fact that I stuck with it all those years, that I was able to kind of receive the message. But, what I absorbed from the teachers here, all of them, was that my terror was the path. My pain was the path itself. And maybe to some of you, that might sound really obvious. But to me, I tell you, it just wasn't. Some things were obvious, but this particular thing, this was something I was stuck on. And it really wasn't until I was able to allow that terror to completely consume my zazen, then it just, it's like jumping off a cliff, there's no cliff, there's no place to fall, and there's no one falling. And even though I had been practicing for many, many years, This idea of sort of confronting this primordial unnamed dragon in the lair of my own habit. Um, it was pretty liberating, you know. It took me a long time. It took me a really long time to be able to get to a point where I could relax into it. So imperfection, is something that's characterized my practice from the beginning and even right now. So it's not only great, it's kind of, I think, the only place we can be. And my recommendation, respectful recommendation, is that we should just continue our practice. And to me, that means regular meditation practice, joining and maintaining a membership with a Sangha, and studying with authentic teachers. The Sangha is imperfect, the teachers are imperfect, we're imperfect, but somehow it kind of all hangs together. And it's been my personal experience that over time, insight develops, even if it develops slowly. Sometimes it develops more quickly. Sometimes you might have little flashes of something or other. But in the end, what I can say is that it works. So let's be imperfect together in our imperfect Sangha. And thank you for listening. And if you guys want to discuss anything, let's do that. Thank you.